Let me be direct with you from the outset because what unfolded in Cairo over the past 72 hours demands directness. Everyone is focused on the ceasefire negotiations. Everyone is asking whether this represents progress toward peace in Gaza. But what we witnessed on April 27th, 2026 was not a humanitarian gesture. It was not diplomatic posturing. What we witnessed was Egypt fundamentally realigning its strategic position in the Middle East after 70 years of predictable foreign policy. I am looking at a joint statement issued by the Egyptian Foreign Ministry and the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs that has been circulating among Western intelligence analysts since Tuesday morning. What it shows is not a trade agreement, it is not a cultural exchange program, it is not another Belt and Road infrastructure project. What it shows is Egypt granting China exclusive rights to develop and operate a second shipping channel parallel to the Suez Canal, with Chinese naval vessels guaranteed priority passage and the establishment of what Cairo is calling a logistics coordination facility at Port Said. That facility, according to multiple sources familiar with the agreement, will house Chinese military personnel. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this represents the most significant geopolitical realignment in North Africa since Sadat expelled Soviet advisors in 1972, why the United States is responding with what can only be described as controlled panic, and why this decision affects global shipping costs, energy prices, and the balance of power across three continents. This analysis is based on the actual text of the agreement, reporting from Bloomberg, Reuters, and Al Aram, and conversations with analysts who have been tracking Egyptian-Chinese relations for the past decade. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is not speculation. This is happening right now. Let's start with the Suez Canal itself, because understanding what Egypt just gave China requires understanding what the Suez Canal actually represents. The canal is 193 kilometers long, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. It handles approximately 12% of global trade and 30% of global container traffic. Every day, an average of 50 to 60 vessels transit the canal. Egypt collects roughly $9.4 billion annually in transit fees. That revenue represents the second largest source of hard currency for the Egyptian economy after remittances from Egyptians working abroad. To put that in perspective, when the Ever Given container ship blocked the canal for 6 days in March 2021, the disruption cost global trade an estimated $400 million per hour. The canal is not just important to Egypt, it is a critical choke point for the entire global economy. Approximately 8% of the world's liquefied natural gas and 12% of global oil trade passes through the Suez. If you operate a business that imports goods from Asia to Europe, or if you drive a vehicle in North America or Europe, the Suez Canal is embedded in your cost structure whether you realize it or not. Now, according to Egyptian government documents reviewed by multiple news agencies, Egypt has been in negotiations with China for the past 14 months regarding what was initially described as an expansion project. The publicly stated goal was to widen certain sections of the canal to reduce wait times and increase capacity. But the agreement signed on April 27th goes far beyond infrastructure development. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now, let's talk about what Egypt actually agreed to and why it matters. Announcement number one, the second channel and Chinese operational control. And this one matters more than anything else because it establishes a precedent that no other nation has been granted in the canal's 155-year history. According to the terms of the agreement as reported by Bloomberg and confirmed by Egyptian opposition sources, China will finance and construct a parallel shipping channel along a 40-kilometer section of the canal between Lake Timsah and the Great Bitter Lake. The construction cost is estimated at $12 billion, which China is providing through its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and China Development Bank. The repayment terms are favorable, 2% interest over 30 years, but here is what Egypt conceded in exchange. Chinese state-owned shipping companies will receive priority passage through both the existing canal and the new channel. Chinese naval vessels, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, and amphibious assault ships, will be granted expedited transit without the standard inspection protocols applied to other nations. And perhaps most significantly, China will operate what both governments are calling a maritime logistics coordination center at Port Said, the Mediterranean entrance to the canal. Let me be very clear about what Maritime Logistics Coordination Center means in the context of Chinese military doctrine. It is not a trade office, it is a dual-use facility that can function as a naval support base. According to Defense Security Asia and multiple Western military analysts, the facility will include fuel storage, maintenance capabilities, and accommodations for rotating personnel. The initial deployment is described as 75 Chinese nationals, but the agreement contains no cap on future personnel levels. Commander Patricia Williams, a former U.S. Naval Intelligence officer who now consults on maritime security, stated in an interview with the Maritime Executive that this represents, and I am quoting her directly here, the most significant expansion of Chinese naval access in a strategic choke point outside of the South China Sea. She went on to describe the implications as fundamentally altering the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea. Egypt currently allows approximately 5,500 vessels per year through the canal. With priority access, Chinese vessels, which already represent roughly 18% of canal traffic, will effectively control throughput during periods of high congestion. That matters. When ships wait in queue at either end of the canal, transit times extend by 12 to 48 hours. For perishable goods, for time-sensitive manufacturing components, for energy shipments, those delays translate directly into costs. Chinese companies will not bear those costs. Everyone else will. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the timing and the leverage. This is the part that reveals why Egypt made this decision now and why the United States could not stop it. Egypt's economy is in severe distress. Inflation hit 33% in February 2026. The Egyptian pound has lost 68% of its value against the dollar since 2022. Foreign currency reserves, which are essential for importing food and fuel, dropped to approximately $25 billion, barely enough to cover 3 months of imports. The International Monetary Fund extended a $46 billion bailout package in 2023, but the conditions attached to that bailout, subsidy cuts, privatization, tax increases, have made President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi deeply unpopular. Egypt needs cash. Egypt needs it now. And Egypt needs it without the political pain of IMF conditionality. China offered exactly that. According to reporting by the Financial Times, the $12 billion canal expansion is only part of the package. China has also committed to an additional $8 billion in direct investment into Egyptian industrial zones, a $5 billion currency swap to shore up foreign reserves, and long-term purchase agreements for Egyptian agricultural products, particularly citrus and cotton, that will generate approximately $2 billion annually in export revenue. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the strategic implications become impossible to ignore. The United States knew this was coming. According to Reuters, Secretary of State Marco Rubio traveled to Cairo in March specifically to discourage this agreement. He offered an alternative package, $6 billion in loan guarantees, expedited military aid releases, and renewed support for Egypt's IMF program. President Sisi declined. The White House then dispatched CIA Director William Burns, who has extensive experience in Middle East negotiations, for a second round of talks in early April. That effort also failed. Why? Because the American offer was economically insufficient and politically toxic. $6 billion in loan guarantees still requires Egypt to borrow money and repay it with interest. It still requires compliance with IMF austerity measures that are politically unsustainable. And it still ties Egypt to a strategic partner, the United States, that is increasingly viewed across the Arab world as complicit in what many Egyptians see as a genocide in Gaza. Announcement number three, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. Egypt's decision is not just about economics, it is about reshaping regional power dynamics in ways that directly challenge American influence from the eastern Mediterranean to the Horn of Africa. Look at what else Egypt committed to in this agreement. Joint military exercises with the People's Liberation Army Navy in the Red Sea, scheduled to begin in October 2026. Intelligence sharing on maritime security threats, which effectively means Egypt will provide China with data on U.S. and Israeli naval movements. And perhaps most tellingly, Egypt has agreed to abstain from joining any multilateral sanctions regime targeting China without Beijing's explicit consent. That last provision was buried in paragraph 27 of the agreement, but it is the most consequential. It means that if the United States imposes sanctions on China over Taiwan, over trade disputes, over human rights concerns, Egypt will not participate. It means Egypt has voluntarily constrained its own sovereignty in exchange for economic relief and strategic protection. That is not a partnership of equals. That is a client relationship. The reason Egypt accepted those terms is the same reason Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates have all expanded their strategic relationships with China over the past 5 years. They no longer believe American security guarantees are reliable, and they no longer believe the American economic model serves their interests. Received. That is announcement number three. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The story you are hearing is that Egypt made a pragmatic economic decision to accept Chinese investment because it needed the money. That story is true, but incomplete. The story you are not hearing is that the United States is losing its grip on the most strategically important country in the Arab world, and Washington has no effective response. Think carefully about what this represents. When Egypt, a country that has received over $80 billion in U.S. military and economic aid since the Camp David Accords in 1979, chooses to grant China strategic military access over American objections, that is not ambiguity, that is not diplomatic nuance, that is a verdict on American power and American priorities. President Sisi's government responded to American pressure by releasing a statement that described the Chinese agreement as a sovereign decision made in the national interest of the Egyptian people. Secretary Rubio called the decision strategically short sighted and economically reckless. That language reveals how little leverage Washington actually has. If the United States had real leverage, Egypt would not have signed the agreement. If American economic incentives were competitive, Egypt would not have needed Chinese financing. The rhetoric from Washington is strong, the reality is weak, and this is not happening in isolation. In the past 18 months, Saudi Arabia has joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a dialogue partner. The UAE has signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with China that includes defense technology transfers. Bahrain has opened discussions with Beijing about expanding port facilities for dual-use civilian and military purposes. Oman has granted China access to Duck Port for naval resupply operations. Every American ally in the Middle East is hedging, and some are no longer hedging. They are choosing. If you own a business that relies on stable shipping costs, if you operate in industries dependent on Middle Eastern energy exports, if you manage supply chains that route through the Suez Canal, what is happening in Cairo is not a foreign policy story. It is a cost structure story. It is a reliability story. It is a question of whether the logistics networks you depend on will remain accessible under predictable rules or whether they will increasingly be controlled by actors whose interests may not align with yours. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same: the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta, the two dominant powers of the Greek world, fought each other for 27 years. Both sides exhausted their treasuries, destroyed their fleets, and depopulated their cities. And who won? Persia. The Persian Empire, which had been defeated by the Greeks at Marathon and Salamis, waited patiently while Athens and Sparta bled each other. Then Persia stepped in, financed Sparta's final victory, and dictated terms to a weakened Greece. The Greeks destroyed each other, Persia reaped the benefits. The parallel is exact. The United States and its traditional allies have spent the past 2 decades focused on conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine and the Middle East. They have spent trillions of dollars, exhausted their public's tolerance for military intervention, and neglected the economic investments that would have kept countries like Egypt aligned with Western interests. China did not fight those wars. China built ports, financed infrastructure, and signed long-term trade agreements. Now China is reaping the benefits. Egypt is playing the role of Sparta in this analogy, accepting financing from the rising power because the declining hegemon can no longer provide what it needs. The United States is playing the role of Athens, losing influence not because it lacks military strength, but because it has prioritized military solutions over economic statecraft. And China is Persia, patient, strategic, and willing to invest where others will not. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, the United States accepts this as the new normal and adapts. Washington acknowledges that it can no longer maintain exclusive influence over Middle Eastern allies. It shifts its strategy toward competitive coexistence, matching Chinese investment where possible and accepting reduced influence where it cannot. This path requires humility and a willingness to share power. It also requires congressional approval for significantly larger economic assistance packages to compete with Chinese financing. Given current political dynamics in Washington, I assess this path as possible but unlikely in the near term. Path 2, the United States responds with punitive measures. Washington reduces military aid to Egypt, imposes economic sanctions, and attempts to isolate Cairo diplomatically. This path has historical precedent. The United States cut aid to Pakistan multiple times when Islamabad pursued policies Washington opposed. But Pakistan survived those cuts and ultimately deepened its relationship with China. Egypt would likely follow the same trajectory. This path risks accelerating the very outcome it seeks to prevent. I assess this path as emotionally satisfying to American policymakers but strategically counterproductive. Path 3, this agreement becomes the template for other countries. If Egypt can secure $12 billion in infrastructure investment, $8 billion in industrial development, $5 billion in currency support, and long-term trade deals, all without IMF austerity conditions, Why would Jordan, Morocco, or Tunisia not pursue similar arrangements? This path leads to a cascade of strategic realignments across North Africa and the broader Middle East. Chinese influence expands, American influence contracts. The Suez Canal becomes the first of multiple strategic choke points where China has preferential access. I think we are already on path 3. The question is not whether it will happen. The question is how quickly. I think we are closer to path 3 than the headlines suggest. Egypt is not an outlier. Egypt is a leading indicator. The decision announced on April 27th was not made in isolation. It was made after watching Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Pakistan, and other countries secure better terms from China than they could get from Washington or the IMF. Egypt calculated that the risk of American displeasure was worth the reward of Chinese investment. Other countries are making the same calculation right now. But here is what I am watching. Two indicators will tell you whether this realignment is temporary or permanent. First, watch whether Egypt allows Chinese warships to use Port Said for operational deployments beyond simple transit. If Chinese naval vessels begin staging out of Egypt for patrols in the eastern Mediterranean or Red Sea, that represents a permanent shift in the regional security architecture. Second, watch whether other countries in the region announce similar agreements in the next 6 to 12 months. If Jordan, Tunisia, or Morocco sign comparable deals, Path 3 is confirmed. Here are the questions I want you to take away. Can the United States offer a credible economic alternative to Chinese financing that does not require painful austerity measures? Does Washington have the political will to compete economically in regions it has historically managed through military aid and diplomatic pressure? And most fundamentally, are we witnessing the end of American primacy in the Middle East? Or is this a temporary setback that can be reversed with better policy? Tell me in the comments what you think the Biden administration should do in response to this agreement. Tell me if you think Egypt made the right decision or whether this will backfire in ways Cairo does not yet understand. We will keep tracking every development in Egypt, China, and the broader Middle East realignment. That is what this analysis does every single day. Subscribe now, share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand how global power is actually shifting in 2026. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.